Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3. We finished the paragraph on page 1344. Aleph Shin Daled Mem. And to summarize, learning about the Teshuva of Tzaddikim on the language that he introduced here, that a tzaddik is compared to Shem Ma and a Baalei Teshuva to Shem Ba'n, because Shem Ma is Mamayel Lamata, Oir, divine energy coming downward, the Ayin coming to transform the Yesh, coming to transform the darkness, Oir Yashar, another way of putting it, and a Baalei Teshuva is Mamata Lamayla, from the bottom up, beginning a state of darkness and distress and pain and distance, and going upward from the Yesh to the Ayin, transforming the darkness from within. From within means by revealing the source of the Helam Ha'atzmi of this darkness in the first place, as we learned at length. But here, the plot thickens by introducing that the tzaddik too has the quality of tshuva, which comes through Mashiach. Mashiach osalav sovet tzaddikai b'tiyufta. So Shem Ma has within it also an element of Ba'n, what he called at the end of the paragraph, Ba'n de Ma, the Ba'n within Ma. So it has both elements. It has the oir of the tzaddik, obviously, because the tzaddik still is the divine soul, which is the most powerful part, like he said before, the ikr by the tzaddik is Amshachas Ha'oir. However, as he climbs that very Amshachas Ha'oir, as he goes into higher levels of oir, and specifically when Mashiach comes, when the Shem Ma will be revealed in its etzem, without the sheath, without the partition of the forehead and the face, so then he will sense the inadequacy that he's like a chayta, relatively speaking. And that will cause a deeper and higher level of tshuva, even than a person who actually did sin, a person on a lower level. As we explained that whole relativity concept, that it's not about how powerful the blemish is, but it's the person on the stature, like he said, okay. So therefore, he also will have this element of tshuva, and that's why Dafka Mashiach, because Mashiach reveals, V'gova Mo'ed, will reveal this level, the Shem Ma Be'etzem, as he called it. Now, he qualifies. However, that Shem Ma is not choshech mamish chas v'shol, not, God forbid, actual darkness. It's only light that's considered like darkness compared to his awareness and consciousness now. And that's the slach lanu that he says in Shemoneh Esrei, ki chatonu, because now he's on that higher level and he's aware of that. He compared to Chayla Gematria Memtes, Chayla, they didn't reach the 50th gate, only 49, like Moshe Rabbeinu. So it's Einzach Chayla Cheshach Mamish. It's not actual sick or dark, sick person or dark or dark actual darkness, but it's Tzaddikim, it's Milas Nafsham V'Dakis Hargoshosam. Hinigam Binyanim Kela Tshuva Me'emek Primis Hanefesh, and that's the Ba'n within Ma. Okay. And now we're going to move to the Baalei Teshuva itself. What about the real, actual Baalei Teshuva, not the tzaddik that's doing tshuva? Well, before we go there, I just want to add something to the whole discussion here, which maybe I should have mentioned earlier, but never too late. And that is that a big basis of this mimer, this discourse in Ayin Beis, especially in volume 3, primarily 3 main themes that we have discussed, are based on a mimer from the Mittler Rebbe, which is actually called to understand the idea of Mashiach Osalas of Sovet Tzaddikai B'tiyufta. So there's a mimer from the Mittler Rebbe that's over 100 pages long. I think it's 120, 130 pages, if I recall correctly. It's printed now, today it's printed in my Mori Admurham Tzoi Kuntresim. So Kuntresim, there's a collection of different Kuntresim, which are publications that the Mittler Rebbe said and then published very often in his own time, because he was a publisher as well of the Maimarim. So in his usual style, at length, which is based on that same name of the Maimer, that was said by the Alter Rebbe on Shabbos Asher Vayelach, Shabbos Shuvah, it appears, Tov Kuf Samach Gimel. So Tov Kuf Samach Gimel would be the equivalent of 1802. So if you remember, I mentioned Tov Kuf Samach Beis, Kibiyem Azeh Yechaper was the Maimer the year before, and Yom Kippur, also Shabbos Shuvah. This is Tov Kuf Samach Gimel. And the three main themes that are addressed there, that is very much a basis, not just a basis. I found the actual language. The actual language is of page 1343 and 1344 is straight from that mimer, almost word for word. I often compare the two and I mark up my Ayin Beis to see the differences. I haven't done that yet, but it's very clear. It's word for word. And the three main themes is going backwards, this concept of the example of the animal and the human being defiling the king's chambers there, in the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe elaborates, Zera Adam, Zera Behema. And in general, this whole concept of even the language, is from the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. And also Ma'aban, and this is scholars of Ma'aban, is all based on that discourse. But in addition to that, what's interesting is that the flow of Ayin Beis, remember there were different themes we've been learning over the last whatever period since we started volume 3. The second theme that's there is Havai Yechata Meriva, that the enemies of God will be shattered, and the different levels of how that will shatter, transformed, which was a theme earlier in this Ayin Beis, including the end of the pasuk, the Yitan Eiz Mamalke, the Yorim Kerem Meshiche. So that was also, we also explained that at length, is all based on this mimer. And finally, the third theme is the whole topic of Gan Eden and Elam Haba, which I made reference to yesterday, is also elaborated there in this discourse. So just as a note that some sources for what we've been learning. And if I discover any key distinctions or additions, I'll obviously point it out as I've always done. But right for now, just for the record, it's based on there. And as I said, I will do some more comparison and more study of it. So with that said, we'll now go to on page 1344. I'm going now to the new paragraph. And these pages, if you're want to follow the text, can be found at ayinbeis.com. So we're going now to the paragraph that starts Omnam. So now we're going to the Baalei Teshuva. Now we know we've already established that the Baalei Teshuva is coming from a dark state, so that's Shem Ban. But he's now going to explain that the Baalei Teshuva also has Shem Ma in it. Just as the Tzaddik has Shem Ban, the Baalei Teshuva also has Shem Ma, because he also has a soul. Though the focus and his primary avodah is coming from darkness, but to say he doesn't have a Shem Ma is incorrect either, and he's going to elaborate on that now. So we're going to see here how everything comes together here. So he says, Omnam. However, Gam Baalei Teshuva yesh be'em b'chinas Shem Ma. Also in the Baalei Teshuva, they also have a Shem Ma. Shariat Teshuva gam kin b'haneshama elokis. So even though the cause of the cry came from the darkness, but the tshuva itself is also in the neshama elokis, is the divine soul, the ikra ho mebchina shema. And we know a neshama elokis, the divine soul, comes from shema. Ukameshikosav mashmoi umashem b'noi. So Chassidus interprets that verse. It says mashmoi. What's his name? What's the name of his son? So Chassidus explains that that's referring to shema. Uma Shem B'noi. That not just what is, but the name is Shema. And that refers to the neshama. So in other words, a Baalei Teshuva, even when we said earlier that a Baalei Teshuva's soul is lost, you said that, Evdim be'eretz asher, and kal shebekalim. But never said that the soul disappears, God forbid. The soul never disappears. It's just completely lost. It's completely concealed, like completely swallowed up in darkness. And the only thing that wakes up the neshama, I mean, there's also other scenarios, but one thing is its distress, its deathly cry of distress of darkness. like by Rabbi Elazar ben Dodaya, for example, which incidentally is also brought in the Maimer from the Alter Rebbe and Mittler Rebbe that I just mentioned before. So it also has a neshama likis. Ubefrat la'acharat tshuva, and specifically after the B'hitas tshuva, the b'chinas v'Yaakov holach ledarkei, b'kiyam ha'teira v'mitzvot shezeu b'chinas shema. So the pasuk Yaakov holach ledarkei, of course, is used in many different ways. It's referring to the actual verse of Yaakov when he's going back to Israel after his 20 years by his father-in-law Lavan. He built his family with Rachel and Leah. So it says, "V'Yaakov halach ledarkei." But Chassidus explains Yaakov halach ledarkei. We all know it's announced after Simchas Torah and after Shabbos Bereishis that when we go back on our way back into the world. So here he's using Yaakov halach ledarkei, that this neshama that has now done tshuva, the Baal Teshuva, it's like going back on ledarkei on his way. What way? In performance of Torah mitzvahs, because he's found his way. That's the whole point of the tshuva. And that too is Shema. So both his neshama is Shema and the Torah mitzvahs that he embraces after the tshuva is Shema. So he also has Shema. The Gam Yesh Lemer, and we can also say the Inyan Shema, the Baal Teshuva, the Baalei Teshuva, who Shebat Teshuva lo yeh b'chinas yitzia legamri. So he's now saying. Now remember, this does not negate the fact that he's coming, that is Avodah from Shem Ban, because remember, it originates. The catalyst is not coming from Shema. By the Tzaddik, it comes from his Gilui and Kiruv, his revelation and his closeness to godliness. Even his sense of inadequacies and Ban is also coming from his revelation. It's not coming from distance. But the Baal Teshuva is the opposite. Everything's coming from distance. So it's like the Ma is coming from the Ban, if you use that train of thought. But right now, so this is a given. Doesn't have to say that because we said it earlier. What the emphasis here is, what is the Ma? So he's now going to give a third element of Ma by the Baal Teshuva, that the point of the Ma is that when he does Teshuva, he should not completely expire. Because you can also say a person who's been in such distress will actually completely, his soul will be lost, like Rabbi Elazar ben Dodaya, when he did Teshuva, then he passed away. He didn't remain alive. So he did Taka Teshuva and Kana Ilama B'Shah Achas. So he's going to explain now that the Ma does an element of grounding, that the Ban should not completely cause the soul to completely leave the body. So that the tshuva should not be one, the return should not be one, that the soul is so passionate, so thirsty, and so distressed that it completely leaves. When Rabbi Elazar died, did tshuva, his neshama left, not to return. So, but that's not the kavanah. Even though there is achieved a great level, but the Shema is there to ground. So he says, the mavur b'mokam acher, sheyesh madrega b'tshuva shalamaylam izeh. Is explained elsewhere that there's a level of tshuva that's higher than the tshuva of Rabbi Elazar ben Dodaya. For who? She'ima yesib b'chinas emek u'pnimis hanefesh. That even though the tshuva is coming from the depth and the innermost part of the soul, mitzad hameitzer b'yeser, due to the intense distress and of the soul, ad shemachlo ma'avid gama shabo b'tzir chemer gashmi, to the point that this distress call, machla, it annihilates, it dissolves, uma'abid, and just two different words. One is dissolved, one is what would be the other word? They're both basically the word dissolve. Even that which comes with sir chemer gashmi. So think of it this way: you have a flame, a fire. The fire is burning, regular flame. That's fine. But remember, by a Baal Teshuva, the flame has become. We don't see any flame. The flame has become not extinguished, but definitely completely concealed. That's why we learned earlier that it has to come from the tzur chalamish, which is like a flintstone, because the flame is not in any revealed way. So you have to dig deeper. That digging deeper is coming through the distress, like when you strike the stone. It's coming from almost like a shock treatment. So that shock or that distress call is so intense that when the flame begins to burn, the flame can completely consume the wick and the fuel altogether. That's what he's saying here. So even though this tshuva is coming from such a deep distress to the point that it consumes is a good word also, machla, consumes and dissolves. Also the tzir chemer gashmi of the very person, like what happened by Rabbi Eliezer ben Dedaya, that his soul left him. The body no longer, he says, there's a higher level. His spirit remains within him, and does not get consumed in a kaloyin legami, in a total consumption, in a total dissolving, total annihilation. And so he remains an existing entity. And afterwards, after this deep, passionate call, distress call, and cry, he's able to perform. He performs Torah mitzvahs. So again, with Rabbi Eliezer ben Dedaya, that's not what happens. So he says in the Self where it explains there's a higher level of tshuva, and the yesh leima here that's what the ma is introducing. The ban on its own, if it only had ban, it can reach a level of total klei nefesh, like he says, complete consumption, being consumed with that thirst, with that passion, with that distress. But here we're talking about a higher level that he remains existing. Nishar ruche bekirbe. If I recall correctly, this is also from that mimer, but I have to double check. So I'm not 100% sure. I'm almost sure I saw it there. So now that you find there's also an element of ma. Now the parentheses is going to explain two ways to explain why that's the case. But before I get to the parentheses, let me stop here if anybody wants clarification, because there's definitely new subject matter that we haven't learned till now. He's not repeating something we learned, he's introducing new ideas. So let me stop if anybody wants to ask anything.
After his tshuva, he becomes like a Bainani or a Tzaddik, and he's in the first category. Then it's like, it's done, right? After that,
why can't you just call him about tshuva? Why do you have to call him a tzaddik or a Bainani? That's a different level.
Because you actually called him about tshuva. Actually, the guy we were talking about was the guy that was coming to become a Baal Tshuva. And I don't know, it's a question of present or past, or what he's doing right now.
The Rebbe Rashab
he's a Baal Tshuva from his past. Is he Baal Tshuva completely all the time?
He remains a Baal Tshuva. What's wrong with that? It's a very high level. It's higher than
that's a title of a past thing that he did.
You're asking something or you're saying something? I'm not sure.
I'm asking and saying something because I don't understand the way it's used. It's used.
What's the question? I'm not sure what the question is.
He's a Baal Tshuva because he did 27 years ago. He did some tshuva, and now he's acting like a regular from birth guy, whatever. Okay, so in the past he was a Baal Tshuva, but
it's not a past. You're asking why do you still call him a Baal Tshuva 27 years later?
Yeah, he's like Baal Tshuva means somebody that's continuously doing tshuva, and a tzaddik also does continuous tshuva, but a big amount of tshuva that was done, and then he's like, I don't know, maybe I'm looking at it funny.
I don't think we're giving labels to anybody here. We're not labeling anyone. We're describing different scenarios. A tzaddik comes from the point of light, and from the light he brings that into the darkness, as we explained. Like ma into ban, ayin into yesh, and so on. And there's also an element of yesh to ayin. And about tshuva starts in the state of darkness because he did not have the light of ma. And then he's saying, but he also has a ma going on, the three different things he just said, the soul, the Torah and mitzvahs, and also the grounding that it does, that it causes him to be intact and continue his work.
But then he continues as
not
a
labeling anybody here. This is not. I don't see any labels here. You're asking a side question. You're asking a question that has nothing to do with this mind. One second. Let me finish saying what I'm saying. Okay. You're asking a question that has nothing to do with this mind. You're asking a question. If a person does tshuva in his life, and he came from a dark place, do you still call him a Baal Tshuva 50 years later, 20 years later? It's a legitimate question, but it has nothing to do with this mind.
He becomes a ma person at that point, predominantly.
You can call him whatever you want. But remember, So what? We're not. Why we need to label anybody here?
No, because we've been comparing two scenarios.
No. To say became a ma person, I don't see that in the Maimer here. He doesn't say became a ma person. It says he's a Ba'n. We said before there are neshamas of Ba'n. There are neshamas of Ba'n. There are people that come in that direct from Ba'n, but he has an element of ma in it. I don't see a need to say he's changed from a Ba'n to a ma. He doesn't say that here. And I don't think you need to say that. It doesn't add or subtract from this level of a person. If he's a true Baal Teshuva, the passion that he developed from his darkness and distress always remains with him, even when he continues. The point he is making here is the opposite, that even though it's such a powerful energy, it didn't consume him to the point of soul being expired, that he can continue to do Torah mitzvahs. I would argue that he does it with the passion of a Baal Teshuva, and that's why when you say b'mokim sheBaalei Teshuva emdim tzaddikim gmurim ein yechelim lamed sham, is not just the moment he did tshuva. His whole life, he will always be in a place that's greater than a tzaddik for this reason. So I see it as a quality, as a compliment, not as a lower level, as a higher level. He always will have that quality because he came from a place of real darkness, and that creates a whole different transformation, especially based on what we learned earlier, transforming the darkness from within, gvuris b'sharshon, which is ultimately reaching the helam ha'atzmi. The Baal Teshuva will always have that. That will always be part of who his identity is. And that has a virtue that a tzaddik doesn't have. That's the whole real theme that he's saying here. So if anything, I would make the argument the opposite way. We're not trying to turn a Baal Teshuva into a tzaddik. We're trying to turn a Baal Teshuva to discover what he's supposed to be. Even a tzaddik, we're saying, also needs the quality of teshuva as much as he's able to on his level relative to his level. That's how I would explain this.
I have a quick question. It's just terminology, and not to get hung up on it, but he uses the word ruach, rucho, makoma kamnisha rucho, and it's interesting, which is the level of the emotions. Before he said, like Rabbi Elazar ben Dodai said, shiyatza nishmasa, which makes sense. But here he says the spirit left, his spirit stayed with him. You would think he would either say nishmasa, which is, I thought, includes the intellect, shema, chachma, or you might say nafsho, because he stays tangibly, physically, he remains present. But he chose the least obvious, if you will.
Well, so let me answer very quickly. In Chassidus, we don't necessarily, unless he compares and says that I'm talking about neshama and ruach, these words are synonymous in generally in Chassidus. So even though it's from a purely linguistic point of view, it is a different word, but generally speaking, these words are usually interchangeable, except when the Chassidus wants to make a distinction. Okay. So you could say neshama, ruach. This is probably the mimer of the Alter Rebbe. He used the word ruach. In Hebrew, ruche b'kirbe is a very common expression that the spirit remains. But it's now whether you can be medayik deeper and say, does he mean the midas? I wouldn't go there because it's pure speculation. But so generally, these things you just leave as being they mean the same thing.
Got it.
In other words, to argue that the neshama did expire and the ruach remained, I wouldn't try to go there. I don't think that's what he's trying to say.
No, I wasn't saying that either, but I was trying to figure out what he is trying to say.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
You did pick up a correct diuk, a correct nuance, the ruach, but that's generally how we understand. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Now he's going to say any other questions? In the parentheses, which is the Rebbe Rashab's edition, he says, "V'tzarech iyun," and this needs further delving into. Im zehu mipnei she'atshuva hi be'efen kazeh. What is the reason that the Shema here is grounding that the neshama is not expiring and not completely being consumed? So he says, is it due to the fact that the tshuva is a unique type of tshuva, higher than the tshuva Rabbi Elazar ben Dodaya. Like it says elsewhere, we talk about Rabbi Akiva. Remember earlier we learned Ben Zema, Hitzitz v'mes. So he says he was affected, not mes, Hitzitz v'nivga rather. He went mad because of the revelation was too great for him. So that was another example where the revelation, but there he was talking more about the two levels of Gvura, Se'er and Dvash, like this too sweet. Here, I don't think he's talking about Rabbi Elazar ben Dodaya, he's talking here about Tshuva. But in that same story, Rabbi Akiva, it says, Nichnas b'shalom v'yotze b'shalom. He entered in peace and came out in peace. So elsewhere it's explained that the Rotze v'shuv by him, he had a far deeper level of bittul than the other three in fundamental different levels. So that's why he was able to enter a very high state of spiritual consciousness, a spiritual revelation, and not be affected by it. One died, one went mad, and one became an apostate. So he's saying similarly, you could say here, why is this high level of tshuva not causing him to expire and be consumed like it was Rabbi Elazar ben Dodaya? Because the tshuva fundamentally, like similar, it's not Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva wasn't tshuva, but similarly, it's a rotze and shuv that's on a deeper level of bittul. So if the bittul is extreme, the bittul can cause you to be consumed. But if the bittul is even a higher level of bittul, you can actually remain on a shama beguf like Rabbi Akiva, and the tshuva will not consume the person. So in other words, the tzarachian, this is one way to explain it, that the tshuva is a higher level of bittul, causes one to have bittul, because why do we get consumed by the fire, by the light? Because we get so caught up in it. But if you have a real level of bittul, the bittul doesn't even let you get caught up in it because you have a goal because Hashem sent you in the neshama down below to make a dira b'tachtein. So like the children of Aaron, it came from great passion. But what was lacking, even a deeper level of bittul would have said, have the passion, but bring it back to tell about it. Bring it back to the guf. So that's one way of explaining this higher level of tshuva. Another way of explaining it, and this is the tzarachin, the Rebbe Rashab is not going to resolve it. He just says there's two ways to explain it. Tzarachin, we have to delve into which one is it. Shezel b'derech schus. Not due to a higher Aveda, but it's b'derech schus. This person merits. In other words, above they give him a gift. It's like a grace, a moment of grace that's giving him a power that he should be able to sustain this high level of tshuva and remain existing in a body and continue doing Torah and mitzvahs. So the first explanation is his avodah is a higher level. The second, it's not his avodah, it's the schus. Now, why he gets a schus? Everybody has different reasons. You can give a schus ovis. It can be to past events in his life. It could be his ancestors. He doesn't explain why. But that's the two ways he explains why this person does not expire like Rabbi Elazar ben Dodaya. But regardless, it is ultimately a power of Shem Ma that's coming into play. Because in this case, Ban would be Rotze, and Ma would be Shuv. So Ban is that distress that's coming from the darkness that's causing a person to run for their life. And they could run so much that they can expire, like he said, be consumed and dissolved in the light, in the passion toward the light. And Ma creates the shuv, which is to bring it back down and ground it, is essentially what he said right now. So if a Baal Tshuva also has that element.
So you can actually call Rabbi Akiva a Baal Tshuva because from a Moshe standpoint, even though he had his bond moment, and as similarly pointed out with Moshe Rabbeinu, called them also Baal Tshuvas.
Well, Rabbi Akiva till age 40 did never learn Torah, so correct. But he's not using that as an example. He's using the story when he went into the Pardes.
Yeah, I understand. But at that point,
he
became a Baal Tshuva again.
So now the Rebbe Rashab continues. So now we see that also by the Baal Tshuva, the other way around, just like we said by the Tzaddik, there's the Yichud of Ma'am Ban, coming from the ma to the ban, like we discussed in the previous paragraph. Here too, by the Baalei Teshuva, we also see now a yichud ma ban. It's not exclusive. It's not that tzaddik is in the world of ma and light. The Baalei Teshuva is in the world of ban and darkness. There's a yichud of ma ban. However, by the Baalei Teshuva, the primary force at work is shem ban. Whereas by tzaddik, the primary force at work is shem ma. So now we see that they both have both, bottom line. Not finished. He's going to continue and explain this further now, or sum it up at least further. So, yeah. Again, I want to repeat that we're coming now, he's tying together many, many, many pages of ideas that have been discussed. And to the end of this paragraph is going to finish the Teshuva and the Tzaddik, Baalei Teshuva and Tzaddik discussion. Then he's going to go back to darkness and light. And then back to V'yadaita Yayim Havayu Elakim. And then Ein Oid. So literally bring together everything that I've been discussing from the beginning of volume 3 and even earlier, from the middle of volume 2. And then on page 1347, just to give you the lay of the land, he's going to go back to the Torah of the Magid that began on page, all the way back on page 896. 896, and even earlier, I'm just looking at volume 2, where he began with the Magid, literally, I'm not exaggerating, where this all began. Yeah, the difference in Torah and Tefillah on page 790. That's how much of this is all coming together now. But I'll point it out when we get closer to the next sections. But I just wanted to tell you where we're like. So there's a certain, we're about to land after a long flight, far from landing, but because there's more to come, but a lot of it is coming together, which is quite interesting, quite exciting. So let's continue here back to the Baalei Teshuva and the Tzaddik. So it says, V'zeu ha'hefresh now. So he just explains, so here too is Yichud Ma Ban, and the Ikar is Ban. Okay. Again, just for the record, this may help understand this a bit. In the last Farbrengen that the Rebbe spoke to the Kinus HaShluchim, Chayesara Tavshinun Beis, the year was 1991. So the Rebbe would always begin the Kinus by speaking at the Farbrengen and dedicating a Sikha, a talk to the Shluchim and about the Shluchim. And it's interesting, I mean, I had the chus to write this, and the Rebbe, very fascinating Sikha. And the Rebbe talks about Yichud Ma Ban, and relatively in ways that help us a little more applied and practical. He talked about the Parsha that was Parsha Teldes, a Chayesara rather. And Chayesara is the Shidduch of Yitzchok and Rivka. So Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe says that Yitzchok and Rivka, Yitzchok and Rivka is Yichud Ma Ban. And that's the first real marriage in the Torah. Even though Avram and Sarah, but you don't hear the story about them joining, meeting. The story in the Torah, the first actual courtship and the first actual marriage that you find is Yitzchak and Rivka, because it's Klolos Kol HaTorah, which he says, Kol HaTorah Kula is the Yichud of Ma'aban, Oyer and Keli, or in the language we're speaking here, like the language of Yosher and Erchezer. So if you want to look it up, it could be a little more elaborate, a bit more on what Yichud Ma'aban is.
Where do I find it? Which Sikha that year?
Chayesara Tavshinun Beis.
Okay.
So there's a book called Sefer HaSichas Tavshinun Beis, and the Sikha of Chayesara there. Yeah. So now he says like this: V'zeu ha'hefresh bein Teshuva, the Tzaddikim LaTeshuva, the Baalei Teshuva, the Baalei Teshuva, and this is the difference between the Teshuva, the return of Tzaddikim that we discussed, and the Teshuva of Baalei Teshuva. The Tzaddikim, in the righteous, he b'bchinas hamshacha lamata. The Teshuva is hamshacha lamata. It's a transmission below, coming from a higher state to a lower state. Ubabal Teshuva, he b'bchinas halal l'mayla. The Teshuva is an elevation from below up. So one is a transmission downward, and the other is elevation upward. For who? And this is that the tzaddikim, ha'ikir hu ha'oir. In tzaddikim, the primary force that's at work is oir, is light, revelation, awareness, godly consciousness, divine consciousness. V'gam ha'tshuva hi mitzad ha'oir. And also their tshuva is due to oir. As we said, that even the level when they feel inadequate, they say slach lanu. It's also due to not due to lack. It's not because they went distant, because they got closer. And the closer they got, the more they became aware of that. And that's why by tzaddik, this awareness, this is causing increasing hamshacha, that the energy should come downward, all the way down into the physical, into the yesh. Doesn't say here the word yesh, but in the previous paragraph he said that. Baalei Teshuva, ha'ikar hisapkus ha'cheshach. By the Baalei Teshuva, the primary force at work is the transformation of darkness. And that's why in general it's in a state of elevation, because you're going from the dark to the light. So light by nature is a descender. It's hamshachas ha'or. It extends. It's ispashas ha'or. And from the darkness to the light is a state of halal and elevation. How is that? And he now brings an example. This is also from the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe that I mentioned before. Asovet Tzaddikai b'tiyufta. This is like the famous example. So this is a famous example brought in Chassidus. It goes like this. The Moshe do bebeis b'nei Adam. About two people. Echad oimid lamayla ma'oid. One person is standing in a very high space, like on a mountain. Va'beis lamata ma'oid. And another person is standing very low. Think of it like in a valley. He doesn't use mountain and valley, but basically one is in a very high state, one is in a very low state. Two people. Sheyesh beizefanim biyechudam v'chiburam. There's two ways that they can join, they can unite and join together. Echad she'elyon yered legabe atachten. One scenario is that the one above comes down to the one below. V'habeis, and a second scenario, she'hatachten yalu legabe elyon, that the lower one goes up and climbs toward the one above. So there's two ways they can meet and join. But then there's a third way. They meet halfway. Va'efana gimel, and the third scenario, the third way, hu sha'elyon yered achetze ahad, that the one above comes down halfway down the mountain, va'atachten eila ad chetze ahad, and the lower one goes up half the mountain. Shemekem chiburim hu be'emtza, and in that case, what happens? They join right in the middle of the mountain. They meet halfway. So three scenarios. The top one goes all the way down, the lower one goes all the way up, or they meet in the middle. Like it says elsewhere. So in the context of Avodah, you can also explain this. He doesn't spell it out. He's only going to spell out la'asad lave, but in the context of Avodah, you could say one is where the first one, when the one above comes all the way down, like pure tzaddikim. Their whole Avodah is ma, but they also come down below and they also deal with the yesh, with the cheshech, but from the top down approach. A pure Baalei Teshuva is someone that's completely the opposite direction, completely from the darkness, but he goes all the way up also to Shema. His Teshuva does reach, like we spoke earlier, ma. And then meeting halfway doesn't spell it out, but you could say maybe it's like an in-between type of person who has a combination of both. Maybe like a Beinoni, maybe. Again, it's speculation. I don't know if that's what he means, but he definitely said all three. Now he's going to say la'asid lave. Going back to Mashiach, la'asid lave, he says, aval la'asid hayedet shemam l'may lamata mamish k'moishu be'etzem mamish. La'asid lave, we spoke before about shema, right? The shema today, it's only b'derech bikia. It only pierces the face, meaning the glow you see on the face and the forehead. But the shema itself remains fundamentally concealed. So the Asid Love, he says, shema will come down from the top down, mamish, kameshu be'etzem mamish. It will come down all the way down, exactly as it is above. In other words, there'll be no compromise. Unification of Avodah of Ba'n below, all the way down, not halfway down, all the way down. That's why it's an aval, because it can come halfway down, but la'asid will come all the way down. The zeu ba'avedas tzaddikim ba'tshuva shalahem, and this is, we're going back to Mashiach causing tzaddikim to do tshuva. This is the work of tzaddikim in the next page, 1345, in their tshuva. So that's from the tzaddikim's point of view. Then he says, "V'shem ban yala lamayla mayla mamish," and the same thing the other direction. It also won't be halfway. Shem ban below will go up mayla mayla mamish, all the way up to the top, literally. V'yiya yichud d'shem ma'al ban lamayla, and there'll be not just the yichud d'shem ma'al ban lamata. That's by the first that they both join together down below. But here they'll both join together above. That the Eir of Shem Ban, which essentially is the Eir of Helam Atzmi, will radiate the way it is in its core root and source. The Yichud the Ma'al Ban, and there'll be the unification, the fusion of Ma'al Ban. Now, he's not spelling out exactly the details, so I'm going to explain whatever. I want to read it till the end of the paragraph before I explain. V'zeu sheyi havaya chod, and and this is the meaning that la'asid love will be havaya chod. Like we know it says, v'hoya b'yem ahu havaya chod u'shmoya chod, right? So it'll be havaya chod and shmoya chod. It says havaya chod b'yichud d'ma'al ban lamata. That's referring to Ma'al Ba'n below. U'shmoyachad b'yichud the Ma'al Ba'n l'mayla. And shmoyachad, as name will be one, means that the yichud of Ma'al Ba'n above. That's how he explains it right now. Avayachad or shmoyachad. Then but he adds in the parentheses, O yesh leimer, or we can say a different way. The avayachad hu shamati yir kamoya mayla. Avayachad means that what is below will be like above. The shema, that the yesh itself will be in a state of oir of shema. So now Havaya Chod he's interpreting it like it's Lamaila, that the yesh will be oir of ma, the way it's Lamaila. Ushmoya Chod is the other way around. That the cheshach, the darkness itself, will become oir, the true transformation of the darkness from within. Had is a yichud Ma'al Ba'n lamata, the Ma'al Ba'n lamata. So two opposite ways he's explaining it. One is that Havaya Chod. One second. Yeah, Havaya Chod. Yeah. One is that Havaya Chod is yichud Ma'al Ba'n lamata and Shmoya Chod is lamayla. Or the other way around, Havaya Chod is Lamaila and Shmoya Chod is Lamata. So two different explanations, which this itself needs explanation. What's the difference and why is he saying that? But we're just reading it right now, and then we'll see what we need to explain. And then he concludes this paragraph, Hakol b'shava, and everything will be equal, u'kamayim lamahava echad be'echad. That he will perform echad be'echad, one and one will meet and joined together. Echad be'echad. So the union of Baalei Ba'n, both above and below, will all be joined in one. So essentially a complete union between Tzaddikim and Baalei Teshuva, and within each one of them, between the Baalei Ba'n, either above or below. Now this is very dense and very brief, especially in context of everything we've been learning about the transformation of darkness to light. Like which one's he talking about here? But obviously we know Tzaddikim is the second level of sweetening. At the end of the day, it's the light that's transforming the darkness. However, it does reach into Shem Ban. And Baalei Teshuva is the other way around. It's reaching the Helam Ha'atzmi, that the Cheshach itself is being transformed, Eina Gvuras Nimtokim Ela B'Sharshan, from within. But remember, we did say that the Helam Ha'atzmi will radiate, like Oyer. But he's now saying that the Oyer will also have the quality of Shem Ban. So, as I explained the other day, and I'll say it again now, it's very clear that he wants to make sure that Oyer and Helam, the Gili and Helam, all become one at the end of the day. But the Baalei Teshuva primarily introduces the Helam Ha'atzmi. And that's his main focus. From the Cheshach comes to Ma, from Ban to Ma. The Tzaddik also has Helam, but the Helam is one really more directed through light. Through light, he comes to understand Helam. In other words, the more revelation he has, the more distance he feels. The Baalei Teshuva, the distance is not through revelation, it's through darkness and through concealment. But both of them will experience Helam, and both will experience Gilui. That's the key thing to remember. Now, even though he doesn't spell it out, it would seem to say that this can explain something we have brought up, and I think you brought it up as well, Yitzchak, that the Rishimu has both elements. The very concealment of Helam Ha'atzmi, Koyach HaGvul, the Etzem Nekudis HaRishimu, and also that within it lies the concealed Oyer, which would make total sense. That means that Baalei Teshuva can access the Rishimu in both ways. He accesses first the Helam through his distress and darkness, and the distress that brings, but then reveals the Oyer that's concealed in there, which is the Ma that we just learned. By the Tzaddik is the other way around. The Oyer also includes in it the power to create the Keli, and also has within it, because remember we learned the Etzem Oyer, even though he said L'maylam is a Helam Ha'atzmi, the Etzem Oyer is higher than Gilui, because the Etzem Oyer does touch the same place with the Helam Ha'atzmi. They both come from the same source. It later will become the track of light, and this is the track of concealment. But here we see how once we, through Avodah, both of the Tzaddik and of the Baalei Teshuva, they all join together. It's just two different directions how this union happens, and you have all the qualities, because everything includes everything else. And at the end of the day, it's not just the qualities that the Tzaddik also has Teshuva, and the Baalei Teshuva also has the Tzaddik, the Ma, but more than that, with different neshamas joined together, that La'asadavi will have that all the souls will unite, and each one will contribute its main quality, with the Tzaddik primarily seeing through the lens of Ma, but also includes Ban, and the Baalei Teshuva primarily through Ban, but also has Ma within it, the Oyer. Now, as far as the parentheses goes, the different ways of explaining, I mean, it's really not that difficult to understand if you really think about it. He just really, he is explaining Havaya Chad and Shmaya Chad two different ways, but essentially the question is, what is the focus here? Is the focus on the Yesh below, meaning the transformation of Dira B'Tachtenim and bringing the Oyer into this world, and it all happens below, which is more focus of the Tzaddik? Or is the focus on connecting to God above, which is more the focus Shmaya Chad in the first interpretation of Baalei Teshuva? In the Yesh, in the Oyesh Lemer, he says that the Mata could be the Yesh will be above, and Shmoi is that the Cheshach below, we will recognize in it the Helam Ha'atzmi. He doesn't say those words, but you'll recognize in it it's the light within it, and the joining of Ma'al Ban Lamata. So the question is really where the focus is, above or below. And the two different ways of interpreting is just two different ways of explaining the idea. So that's
Most
how
of the time we've been saying
that's summing up what we just learned here. Now it's not over, as I said, completely, because from this he's going to go now back to the transformation of darkness to light. So I would probably encourage us all to see what he's going to say. It'll probably help us understand what we just learned as well. But briefly, at least, this is what he's concluded now. And the top of the paragraph, the end of the first paragraph on page 1345, which is where I'm going to stop. Go ahead. Anybody want to ask anything or any
I just
questions?
wanted to say, it's what we've been focusing on, actually, we've been doing, in terms of Ba'n, taking its symptom and bringing it up higher and higher. And that's what we've been dealing with for many, many hours. And now we're getting from both perspectives.
Can you repeat that? I didn't understand what you just said.
No, because for months we've been talking about bringing the symptom to a higher place, which is really Ba'n, and now we're comparing it to the Ma, and it makes perfect sense.
Can't hear you. You have too much background noise.
We've been bringing the symptom up for months. We're talking about it.
The cheshach, yeah, that the helama atzmi. So what are you saying differently?
That's what we've been learning. Basically, we've been learning about, in terms of Ba'n, bringing the symptom up to a higher level, and now we're interjecting it with the Ma part, which is a tzaddikim, and this makes perfect sense.
You have to say it later. I don't hear you. There's too much background noise. I don't understand what you're saying, to be honest.
Rabbi Jacobson.
Yeah.
I have a difficulty understanding that last part about the tzaddikim, but in Lasi Lavo. It says that the Yorei, they'll do the tshuva that they'll do is they'll Yorei Shema Milamayla Lamata. Mamish, they'll come all the way down to the Yesh and Nivra down here. But I thought we've been learning recently that the tshuva of a tzaddik is that they have a chet. Their chet is a feeling of lacking. They keep going higher and higher in godliness and or, and they keep wanting. They feel of the lacking there, and the tshuva there is the cheshech, not the choshech, but the cheshech to go higher and higher and or to go to reach higher levels in godliness. That's where their inspiration, their gevura, so to speak, is pushing them to go higher and higher. So I was a little confused here that he brings it that they're not going higher and higher. They want to come down to Yesh and Nivra, the choshech down here, and illuminate it down here, rather than going higher in levels of or, rather than down here in choshech.
Where did you see this language that they want to go higher and higher? Where does it say that? I don't recall him saying that.
Didn't we learn that yesterday when it says that what is the chet by a tzaddik is that his chet is not an avera, is not Ra itself.
I know what he said, but where does it say that that causes them to want? The bottom line is very straightforward. A tzaddik's is oir. Oir is all about hamshacha, about revealing. The tzaddik continues to grow in the revelation of godliness. As he grows in his revelation, he grows also in his deeper awareness. So it also creates we'll call the passion that comes from tshuva, because now he sees his lack and his inadequacy. So he continues to grow, but its general approach is from the top down, because the tzaddik is mamshech oir, nefesh alikis. That's the driving force. By a Baal Teshuva, very simple. He's coming from a dark place. He's coming from a place where there was a void, a total vacuum, a void of Torah mitzvahs, of godliness, of oir. So he's coming from cheshach, which is below, like lives in this world. A tzaddik in this world is bringing oir into the world. In the process of bringing oir, he also becomes more sensitive to his own lack and inadequacy. And yes, he wants to connect more to godliness, but his role primarily is still being mamshech oir. So fine. So tzaddik also has element of ratziv v'shuv. Everybody has going up and down, but the primary focus is gili oir. By the Baal Teshuva, the primary focus is elevating that which is below, because that's where he originates from. And he also has amshacha, because remember, Baal Teshuva also has to do shema. Remember, Rotze is Ba'n and Ma is Shuv. But he also has to do Torah mitzvahs. That's why we spoke that the Baal Teshuva has to also have Ma to ground him, so he should survive, so he should exist and be able to draw down the divine energy as well. So they both have Halah and Amshacha. Everybody on earth has that. All of Avodah, Tefillah, is from the bottom up. Torah is bringing it down. Everybody has both elements. The question is, where's the primary focus in each one?
In Lasi Lavo, I think that the tzaddik would be would be learning Das Hashem, Malayar's Das Hashem. It would be
Everybody's learning Deus Hashem. But the point of bringing Deus Hashem is to bring and transform this world with it. Like he said, the tzaddik brings it down. He wants to bring Dir B'Tachtenim. The goal is not to stay in Gan Eden. The goal is to transform existence. What
the Rebbe again here? I'm bringing
anyway,
from
not
another.
sure what's going on now. As I said,
Okay.
everybody needs both going up and down. Question is where the focus is. A tzaddik's focus is which is Amshacha. A Baal Teshuva's focus is Halah, which is a transformation of the darkness that's from the bottom up. That's the key thing you have to keep in mind. That does not mean that tzaddik doesn't have any yearning to connect to God. Of course he does.
I guess where I'm processing a little is from other places. The Rebbe has said that
Okay,
we're not. Just let me finish. If you can say where it's wrong, though, that we'll be at the level of Torah so Umunah so and Lasi Lavo, that like the Rashbi, which was a level of being only involved in Torah and learning Torah, and rather than mitzvahs, like he was in the cave, like he was more involved into more Torah learning.
but you just said it right. There's no reference to that here at all.
Okay.
And it's not a contradiction if you start studying it, but it doesn't talk about this here at all.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so we'll stop top paragraph, page 1345. Let us